They laughed when they saw the tiny repair shop with leaking walls and rusted tools. But 30 days later, the same people stood frozen outside a massive factory, watching the man they mocked take away their entire business empire. What happens when humiliation turns into determination? What happens when a quiet mechanic decides he has nothing left to lose? Stay till the end, because this story will prove that the strongest people are often the ones nobody notices. And before we begin, if you love emotional stories with powerful endings, make sure to like this video and subscribe to Kind Soul. Stories for more unforgettable stories. Rain hammered the rusted metal roof of Daniel. Harper's repair shop, as cold wind pushed water through the tiny cracks above his workstation. The garage stood alone at the edge of town beside an abandoned textile factory whose broken windows looked like hollow eyes staring into the darkness. Most people drove past the place without even slowing down. To them, it was just another forgotten corner of the city. But to Daniel, the tiny repair shop meant everything. It was the only thing his late father had left behind after years of hard work and sacrifice. Every morning before sunrise, Daniel unlocked the heavy garage door with tired hands and worked until long after midnight fixing whatever people brought him: old tractors, damaged motorcycles, delivery vans, and sometimes even lawnmowers. His clothes were stained with grease, his boots worn thin, and his hands rough from endless labor. But he never complained because his younger sister, Emily, depended completely on him after their parents died in a tragic car accident years earlier. Despite the struggles, Daniel carried himself with quiet dignity, believing honest work mattered more than wealth. Across town, however, the world belonged to Victoria Carter, the powerful CEO of Carter Industries, the largest automotive company in the region. She was famous for luxury cars, expensive suits, and ruthless business decisions that destroyed smaller competitors without mercy. One stormy afternoon, a black luxury SUV suddenly stopped outside Daniel's garage, splashing muddy water across the broken pavement. The driver quickly stepped out and opened the rear door as Victoria Carter emerged beneath a large umbrella held by her assistant. Her sharp eyes scanned the tiny repair shop with visible disgust. "This is the place?" she asked coldly, her voice filled with disbelief. Daniel calmly nodded while wiping his hands with an old cloth. "Your driver said the engine overheated," he replied politely. Victoria stepped carefully around puddles, as if afraid the dirt itself would touch her expensive shoes. She glanced toward the rusted shelves, cracked walls, and ancient tools hanging beside faded photographs of Daniel's father. A mocking smile slowly appeared on her face. "Honestly," she said quietly to her assistant, "I didn't think repair shops like this still existed." Her assistant laughed softly while Daniel remained silent and opened the SUV's hood. Within minutes, he diagnosed the issue. But Victoria continued walking around the garage, criticizing everything she saw. Then her eyes stopped on the abandoned factory beside the shop. "That building belongs to my company now," she said proudly. "We'll demolish it soon. Places like this are useless." Daniel looked toward the factory silently, remembering the years his father worked there before it closed and destroyed hundreds of families' lives. Victoria smirked confidently before adding, "You should sell this garage too. I could buy your entire future with the money sitting in my purse." The words hit Daniel harder than he expected, but instead of arguing, he simply handed her the repair invoice and said quietly, "You can insult my garage, but don't insult my father's work." The next morning, Daniel Harper barely slept. Victoria Carter's words echoed endlessly in his mind. While he sat alone inside the small repair shop, staring at the abandoned factory beside it, rainwater still dripped from the roof into rusted buckets, and the smell of engine oil filled the cold air. But Daniel's thoughts were somewhere else entirely. He remembered his father returning home exhausted after 12-hour factory shifts, still smiling despite the hardship, because that old textile plant once gave life to the entire town. Families survived because of it. Children went to school because of it. Then one day the owners disappeared, salaries stopped, and hundreds of workers were abandoned without warning. Daniel's father never recovered from the heartbreak. While cleaning an old cabinet that afternoon, Daniel discovered a dusty folder hidden beneath stacks of repair receipts and faded photographs. Inside were yellowed legal papers carrying his father's name along with several signatures and ownership documents connected to the abandoned factory. Confused, Daniel spent hours reading every page, carefully until he realized something shocking. Years before the factory closed, workers were secretly offered partial ownership shares instead of unpaid salaries during financial collapse. Most employees believed the papers were worthless and threw them away, but Daniel's father kept his hidden for decades. With trembling hands, Daniel immediately traveled to the city records office the following morning. The elderly clerk behind the counter adjusted her glasses while examining the documents carefully. At first her expression remained calm, but after checking the computer records, her eyes widened in surprise. "Mr. Harper," she whispered slowly, "these shares are still legally valid." Daniel felt his heartbeat rising. "What does that mean?" he asked nervously. The clerk looked at him again before answering. "It means your father owned 40% of the factory property." Daniel stood frozen in disbelief. For years, Harper Industries publicly claimed ownership of the entire factory after purchasing majority control through complicated legal deals. But according to the records, Victoria Carter only owned 60%. Daniel's father's forgotten shares still represented nearly half the property. News of the discovery spread quickly, and within days, Daniel found himself sitting inside a luxurious conference room, across from Victoria Carter herself. She stared at him with cold fury while expensive lawyers surrounded the table. "This is ridiculous," she snapped angrily. "You expect me to negotiate with a mechanic?" Daniel remained calm despite the pressure. "I'm not asking for favors," he replied quietly. "I'm asking for what belongs to my family." Victoria immediately offered millions of dollars to buy his shares, believing he would surrender instantly. "Name your price," she demanded confidently. But Daniel shocked everyone by refusing. Silence filled the room. Even the lawyers looked confused. Victoria leaned forward, narrowing her eyes. "You have no idea what you're doing," she warned him coldly. But Daniel already saw something she could not see. He saw possibility inside those broken walls. He saw workers returning home with dignity again. And most importantly, he saw a chance to prove that people like him were not worthless. Walking out of the meeting, Daniel looked toward the abandoned factory, standing beneath the gray sky, and quietly whispered to himself, "We're bringing you back to life." The abandoned factory slowly came back to life day by day, and for the first time in years, the empty streets around it were filled with noise again. The sound of welding machines echoed through the giant halls, while old engines roared back to operation. Under clouds of dust and smoke, Daniel Harper worked harder than anyone else, often sleeping only a few hours, each night on a worn-out couch inside his tiny repair shop. His hands were covered in cuts and grease, but he never stopped moving. Former factory workers who once lost everything returned, one by one, after hearing about Daniel's plan. Some were elderly men with gray hair who had spent decades working inside those walls before the factory closed. Others were young workers desperate for a second chance after Harper Industries pushed smaller companies out of business. Daniel welcomed everyone equally. He repaired broken machinery himself, cleaned abandoned storage rooms, and even sold his old pickup truck to buy replacement tools. Meanwhile, across town, Victoria Carter watched the growing activity with disbelief and anger. She had mocked Daniel publicly, believing his project would collapse within weeks. But instead, the old factory was producing affordable, automotive parts faster than anyone expected. Farmers and transport companies started choosing Harper Industries because Daniel's products were reliable and far cheaper than Harper Industries' overpriced equipment. Slowly, customers began leaving Victoria's company. Inside Harper Industries' headquarters, executives panicked during emergency meetings as sales reports worsened every week. "How is this happening?" one investor shouted angrily. Victoria slammed a folder onto the conference table. "He's a mechanic, not a businessman," she snapped. But the numbers told a different story. Harper Industries was growing rapidly because Daniel understood ordinary people's struggles. He wasn't trying to become rich overnight. He simply wanted workers to survive with dignity. One evening, Victoria drove personally to the factory after hearing rumors about its expansion. Her black luxury car stopped outside. The giant gates as trucks loaded with products moved constantly in and out of the property. Workers laughed together during break time, while music played softly from old radios near the loading docks. Victoria stared in shock at the massive sign hanging above the entrance. Harper Industries, the same abandoned factory she planned to destroy, had become her biggest competitor. As she stepped out of the car, several workers recognized her but ignored her completely. That silence disturbed her more than insults would have. Nobody feared her there. Inside Carter Industries, employees lowered their heads whenever she walked past, terrified of losing their jobs. But here, workers smiled proudly while repairing machines beside Daniel, who wore the same oil-stained clothes from his tiny garage days. Victoria spotted him helping a young mechanic fix a damaged engine with his own hands. For a brief moment, she remembered how her own father once built businesses the same way, before wealth changed everything. But pride quickly buried the feeling. This won't last, she whispered to herself while staring at the busy factory. Yet deep inside, Victoria already understood the terrifying truth. Daniel Harper was no longer just the owner of a small repair shop. He was becoming the symbol of an entire town's hope, and that was something money alone could never defeat. 3 months later, the entire town had changed because of Harper Industries. Streets that once looked abandoned were now crowded with delivery trucks, workers and small businesses reopening after years of struggle. Restaurants stayed busy late into the night serving factory employees. Children returned to schools with new uniforms, and families who once feared eviction finally felt secure again. Daniel Harper had become respected not because he was rich, but because he never forgot where he came from. Even after Harper Industries became successful, he still spent hours inside the same small repair shop where his journey began. He repaired old engines himself, drank coffee with workers during lunch breaks, and listened patiently whenever employees shared their problems. Meanwhile, Carter Industries continued collapsing under financial pressure. Investors abandoned the company, customers switched permanently to Harper Industries, and news channels constantly compared Daniel's humble leadership with Victoria Carter's arrogance. Public opinion turned against her completely. For the first time in her life, Victoria felt powerless. One cold evening, unable to ignore the truth any longer, she drove alone to Daniel's repair shop. There were no assistants, no luxury entourage, and no cameras following her this time. The garage lights glowed softly through the rain while Daniel worked quietly beneath the hood of an old truck. The same smell of oil and metal filled the air exactly like the day she first insulted him. Victoria stood silently near the entrance for several seconds before speaking. "You kept this place," she said softly, while looking around the tiny garage. Daniel slowly closed his toolbox and nodded. "This shop reminds me who I am," he replied calmly. Victoria lowered her eyes, noticing the faded photographs of Daniel's father still hanging on the wall. Guilt slowly spread across her face. "When I came here the first time," she whispered, "I thought success meant proving I was better than everyone else." Daniel listened quietly without interrupting. Rain tapped gently against the roof while silence filled the garage. "I spent years building companies," Victoria continued painfully, "but somewhere along the way, I forgot how to respect people." Daniel leaned against the workbench before answering in a calm voice. "My father used to say something important. Machines build products, but kindness builds loyalty." Victoria's eyes filled with tears as she looked around the small garage she once mocked so cruelly. Ironically, the place she called worthless had created something her billion-dollar empire never could: trust, loyalty, and hope. Weeks later, Victoria officially resigned as CEO of Carter Industries after shareholders removed her from power. Reporters expected Daniel to celebrate publicly, but instead he shocked everyone, again by offering jobs to hundreds of Carter employees who suddenly became unemployed. When journalists asked why he would help people connected to the company that tried destroying him, Daniel answered simply, "Workers are never the enemy. Pride is." Those words spread across the country and turned Daniel Harper into a national symbol of humility and perseverance. Years later, despite owning one of the most respected companies in the nation, Daniel still opened his small repair shop every Sunday morning to teach local children how engines worked. And above the garage door hung a simple wooden sign that read, "Never laugh at small beginnings." And if this story touched your heart, don't forget to like this video, share it with someone who needs motivation, and subscribe to Kind Soul Stories for more emotional and inspiring stories.